Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. Welcome. We're glad to see you here. This is Primary Care Development Corporation's webinar on staff wellness, vicarious trauma and burnout. Is it real? What are the differences? I'm pretty sure everyone can answer the is it real question at this point. Of course it is real. Before we get started, I'm Yael Lipton from Primary Care Development Corporation, and my co-facilitator is Angela Fernandez, and she'll introduce herself in a second. Before we get started, just some kind of logistics. If you use the chat box, which you are more than welcome to do, please, when you chat, address all panelists and attendees. We're going to ask for some participation, so it's really helpful if when you're chatting in, everyone can see it and not just us. This is being recorded. We will send you the recording probably sometime tomorrow with the PowerPoint, as well as some resources that we're going to touch upon and mention during the webinar. And this will also be available eventually on our website. Okay, next slide. So just very quickly about Primary Care Development Corporation. We're a national nonprofit, and we're also a community development financial institution. And our mission is really to help improve primary care in underserved communities. Next slide. So we do this in a couple of ways. We have some advocacy work that we do. So we do policy work on the national level as well as the state level, mostly in New York State. We make low interest loans to community health centers and other providers who are serving underserved communities for things like, new buildings, new equipment, electronic health records. They're all low interest loans. And we have what we sort of like to think of as a performance improvement department that I'm part of. And that's really where we do a lot of training and coaching and technical assistance to primary care organizations throughout the country. Next slide. So yeah, our performance improvement, really, like I said, we're just really helping primary care, meet their missions in whatever ways that we can. Okay, next slide. So a little bit about me. I don't want to take up too much time about us, but quickly. I'm trained as a health educator. I spent really the first half of my career providing direct services and creating and implementing programs in underserved communities in New York City. So I did that through primarily health centers, federally qualified health centers, but also in schools and through community-based organizations. In addition, since the beginning of my career, I've also been training healthcare and social service staff and even some education people on a ton of different topics, a lot of reproductive and sexual health, a lot of things around person-centered care, a lot of things around team-based care, motivational interviewing, health literacy, the list kind of goes on and on. I work part-time for PCDC, and my main role here is to create curriculum and deliver training. And obviously until about a year ago, most of that training, if not all of it, was in person, but we were just talking about being able to get back to that soon, which made me very happy because I'm completely done with Zoom trainings, although I'm still happy to be here with you. So I'll let Angela introduce herself.
Yeah, you're so funny. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Angie Fernandez. I am the Assistant Director for a New York City-based organization, Sexual Assault and Violence Intervention Program, which is based out of Mount Sinai Hospital. And a little bit about me, I have been working in the field of gender-based violence and in victim services for the past 15 years. Similar to Yael, I started my career as a health educator. It's actually where we met, as working on sexual health issues, and have done a ton of training also with my time at the beginning of my career as sexuality educator, focusing a lot on adolescent health, but also doing a lot of professional trainings and continue to do so. So really providing training on trauma-informed care, on responses to sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and working with a whole host of different disciplines like medical staff, social services, law enforcement, and similar, basically anyone who's providing services to survivors, which is, pretty much everyone. And really happy to be here today to talk about something I think that is so relevant, especially now. So.
Thank you. Next slide. So quickly, what we're going to do today is really talk about the prevalence of vicarious trauma, compassion, fatigue, and burnout among healthcare workers. We're going to look at the similarities and the differences between them. We're going to think about what are the signs of these things. We're going to talk really about how staff wellness impacts patient care. We're going to talk about ways to mitigate the risk of trauma, vicarious trauma, compassion, fatigue, and burnout on both the individual and organizational levels, and really talk about how staff wellness is an integral part of trauma-informed care. And I really just want to pause and say that even though we will go over some individual level interventions, a lot of what we really believe and what the research shows is that a lot of this stuff really does need to come from the organization. And you'll see what we mean by that in a few minutes. Okay, next slide. And we're going to have a quick poll. So hopefully everyone participate. All right. So in the last year, have you struggled with motivation? In the last year, have you struggled with patience? And in the last year, have you struggled with your mood? So go ahead and fill that out, and then we'll share the results when we get them. Sorry, and then there's one more. In the last year, have you struggled with feeling empathy and compassion for patients? You just have to toggle down if you didn't see it, like I forgot to see it. And Kimmy, I think you'll just share the results when you get them. There we go. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see this. So we have 91% of people struggled with motivation in the past year. 89%, sorry, have struggled with patience. 86% have struggled with their mood. And 39% have struggled with feeling empathy and compassion for patients. Okay, so thank you so much for doing this. This really obviously highlights that most people in healthcare will experience some of these symptoms at some point, in their lives. And especially, obviously, we did the last year, although it's more than a year now, right? Because of, COVID-19 and the pandemic. So sometimes it's difficult to identify symptoms in ourselves or really to admit it. We're really more likely to see these changes in our colleagues, and we can intervene. And we have one more poll for you. Okay, so in the last year, have you noticed signs of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, or burnout in one or more of your colleagues? Okay, so again, everyone can see 90% of you have definitely noticed this in colleagues. And again, like I said, that makes sense. Sometimes it's easier to recognize these things in other people than ourselves. We're going to talk about, what the impact and what to do about that. So thank you so much for that. Clearly, this shows that this is a really relevant topic, and we're happy that you're here with us. So next slide. Okay, let's really dig into what these things are. We'll look at the similarities and we'll look at the differences. Next slide. So I love this quote by Rachel Remen, who's an integrative medicine doctor and professor in California. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So this is really true, or I find it to be really true. We really cannot become, trauma informed, be there for our patients if we're not trauma informed in our places of work and with each other. And we can't do this work without it affecting us. So it's totally normal to be affected by it. So how we respond to its effect is really the challenge, right? Both on the individual level as well as the organizational one. Next slide. So burnout is a combination of exhaustion, cynicism, and perceived inefficacy resulting from long-term job stress. So it was actually first described in '74 by this clinical psychologist, Herbert Freudenberger, who volunteered at a free clinic in the then drug-ridden East Village of New York City. Over time, he observed emotional depletion and accompanying psychosomatic symptoms among the clinic's volunteer staff. So this is, again, it's really this result of excessive demands on our energy, strength, and resources in the workplace. And we can really feel malaise, fatigue, frustration, and this inefficacy. It's really about exhaustion and disconnection that when job satisfaction is low, and we can sometimes feel powerless or overwhelmed. And stressful conditions are really often the cause, whether or not we have unmanageable workloads. Does that seem to resonate with anyone? Insufficient pay, unrealistic demands, lack of opportunity to give input, inflexible work schedules, toxic or abusive managers. And burnout can happen to anyone in any workplace. It's not just about healthcare, right? You can work in a restaurant and be burnt out. You can work in real estate, a classroom, or a factory, or really anywhere. Okay, next slide. So in one Medscape News survey where there were 15,000 physicians, they found that the overall burnout rate was 42%. Don't worry, we're going to get to other healthcare workers too. 45% of resident physicians experience burnout, so they haven't even really started their career, right? Almost 100% of medical professionals agree that burnout is an issue. Yet 40% of physicians are reluctant or don't want to seek mental health treatment. And 40% of doctors with this burnout say that they lack resources in their job, which contributes to the burnout. And just for some context, over half of doctors work 50 to 80 hours per week, which obviously is a lot. So, even with these high stats, we would say kind of overall, the industry has not done a great job addressing burnout. We really do not see widespread programs or tons of research or resources on this. It's definitely starting to pick up. And I think COVID has certainly exacerbated it and accelerated it. But again, not enough. So next slide. So here we see that 1/3 of nurses have high burnout and that doctors are up to their eyeballs in debt, which can certainly be a cause of stress, and they feel they don't get paid well enough. So what might be causing all of this? Certainly many things. Nurses and doctors spend half of their days on electronic health records. This really shook me. I just want to let that sink in for everyone. Half of our days are spent catering to a computer, basically. So you go into one of these, professions because you want to heal, right? You want to care for people. And then you spend half of your time caring for the electronic health record. This has to have an effect on morale. And almost half of healthcare workers are not getting more than 7 hours of a night of sleep. And we all know sleep is a must, that we must sleep in order to function well and in order to be healthy. A bunch of years ago when I got a new primary care provider, she was an older woman, she's retired now. And I was with the office during 2 transitions for electronic health records. And one day she just turned and looked at me and said, I used to take care of patients. Now I just take care of the computer. And then only a couple of years later, she retired. And I always think about that when I'm thinking about all the time that we spend on this technology. Okay, next slide. So what else can drive physician, in particular, burnout? There's obviously many things. I love this cartoon, right? So what seems to be the problem, Mrs. Johnson? And she's just saying, I feel the way you look. And I think many of us can relate to that. So certain specialties see higher burnout rates like emergency medicine, general internal medicine, neurology. And I thought the last two were particularly interesting. Being a woman in medicine and having children under the age of 21 is a factor in burnout. So I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I have to assume that this is really still about women still carrying more of a load at home with children and housework. At least in heterosexual relationships, right? And then, of course, good old-fashioned gender-based, discrimination, certainly. Okay, next slide. So burnout during COVID-19. So this is a few months old now, but I think, and I think things will probably starting to look a little bit different, which is a good thing. But obviously, I think it's still important to look at this because these effects are still, people are still feeling these effects, even if their day-to-day is not as busy. And in some places it is still as busy, right? So 93% were experiencing stress, 86% anxiety, 77 frustration, 76 exhaustion and burnout, and 75% said they were overwhelmed. And this is all healthcare workers, about a little over 1,000. So more than 3/4 of healthcare workers with children said they were worried about exposing their child to COVID-19, worried about exposing their partner or spouse, and about half were worried they would expose older adults or family members. And really, people were talking about lacking time to be able to spend and parent really well and support their children. So emotional exhaustion was the most common answer for changes in how healthcare workers were feeling over the previous 3 months. Trouble sleeping, physical exhaustion, work-related dread, changes in appetite, headache, stomach ache, questioning whether or not they have the right career, compassion fatigue, and nurses reported a higher exposure to the coronavirus, and they were more likely to feel too tired, which makes, again, a sense, especially since, they weren't allowing any visitors in hospitals. So people were dying, right? And the nurses were really the last ones to say goodbye to patients. And that's just really a lot for anybody to handle, I would think. Okay, next slide. So just a little more evidence that COVID obviously has been having a huge impact on healthcare staff wellness. People feel like they didn't have adequate emotional support, and nurses, almost half, felt like they didn't have the emotional support. And the top 3 work-related stressors were uncertainty about when things would settle down or return to normal, burnout, and increased workload. Okay, next slide. So when thinking about burnout in particular, it's really helpful to think about it in 5 stages. Stage 1 is the honeymoon stage, where we would call this kind of characterized by enthusiasm. Stage 2 is really where stress starts and feeling stagnation. Stage 3 is chronic stress leading to frustration. Stage 4 is really burnout, and stage 5 is kind of habitual burnout and past burnout, really needing an intervention. So let's look a little bit more closely at each of these stages. Next slide. Okay, so stage 1, the honeymoon phase. And many times when we undertake a new task at a job or we start a new job, we often experience high job satisfaction. We're committed, we have energy, we feel creative. So this is, again, especially true of a new job role. People, want to prove themselves. They're excited about accepting new responsibility and have enough energy, and they're optimistic. So the second stage of burnout begins with an awareness of some days being more difficult than others. People may find their optimism waning, as well as notice common stress symptoms that are affecting them physically, mentally, or emotionally. These can be things like anxiety, avoidance of decision-making, change in appetite or diet, being tired, forgetting, grinding teeth at night, inability to focus, headaches, lower productivity, problems sleeping, and other things as well. This third stage of burnout is chronic stress. So this is really marked, this is a marked change in the stress levels. So going from motivation to experiencing stress on an incredibly frequent basis. Also more intense symptoms than in stage 2, and they really range here. From anger to apathy to exhaustion, missed deadlines, feelings threatened or panicked, pressured, and even using more alcohol or drugs to cope. So I noticed somebody asked for the picture bigger. If you're on Zoom, you're able to make the picture bigger by kind of making the screen a little bit bigger. I know I can easily do that on my end. Hopefully that works for you. Okay, so entering stage 4 is burnout itself, where symptoms become critical. Continuing as normal is often not possible in this state, as it becomes increasingly difficult to cope. We all have our own unique limits of tolerance. In this stage, it's important to get help. People may be getting chronic headaches, may experience gastrointestinal problems, neglect of personal needs, feeling empty inside, desire to drop out of work or society, social isolation, and self-doubt. The final stage of burnout is habitual burnout. So this means that the symptoms of burnout are so embedded in your life that you're likely to experience a significant ongoing mental, physical, or emotional problem, as opposed to occasionally experiencing those things. And this, people can feel really sad, mental and physical fatigue, and ultimately, depression as well. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue really refers to the really profound emotional and physical exhaustion that healthcare workers can develop over the course of our careers when we're unable to refuel and regenerate. So we may notice a change in our ability to tolerate strong emotions in our patients, even with our colleagues, and even really with our loved ones, or to listen to difficult stories. Over time, some developed what we call like sort of a detached stance, and we really lose our ability to connect with patients. Researchers have found that compassion fatigue is really a normal consequence of working in high stress settings with heavy workloads, and with people who have had, trauma and struggle with many different things in life. So it can also result from being exposed to too many patients with similar problems. So eventually we can become desensitized, we can kind of feel numb. And obviously when that happens, we all know, I don't have to tell you this, right, that's going to affect the care that we provide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're moving to what vicarious trauma is. So sometimes it's called secondary trauma. And it was coined, these terms were coined by researchers who noticed that those in the helping professions were often profoundly affected by their exposure to indirect trauma. So symptoms of symptoms of post-traumatic stress really can appear in some staff members, even if they themselves have not ever been in danger or had any, severe trauma happen to them. They can still report similar things that trauma survivors would report, things like intrusive thoughts, right? Nightmares, preoccupation with client stories, even long after the encounters. So over time, they can develop this vicarious trauma, which is really a shift in how the world is viewed. Over, one terrible story, or really thousands of them, become or can become deeply embedded in our soul, to the point where it changes our sense of safety, and we feel more anxious and more fearful about specific situations. I was recently working with a group of nurses who told me that for them, every motorcycle is a donor cycle, right? They've seen so many accident victims with brain injuries that they no longer believe that riding a motorcycle is safe. And it really vicarious trauma leads to a loss of innocence almost, and interferes with our ability to enjoy daily living and connect with others. Okay, next slide. So up to 85% of helping professionals can develop vicarious trauma, and our high rates of traumatic symptoms, and 1 in 5 psychologists report having suicidal thoughts while confronting a personal or professional difficulty. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Angela now.
Thank you so much, Yael. So that's a lot. And I'm sure a lot of people are shaking their heads, given the results of the poll earlier, that especially now I've, really been thinking about this presentation a lot and thinking, wow, it's been a struggle, we're like dredging through over a year of a pandemic, and things feel harder in a lot of ways now than they did even before. And so a lot of these definitions and symptoms are feeling much more familiar than I'd like to even admit lately. So what does this mean? What kind of impact does all of this have on patient care and the patient caregivers? Next slide, please. So as Yael already explained, a lot of this, again, there's another infographic, but, really the trauma exposure response, that is a transformation. And I think that that's the key word in this, right? That over time, what we're talking about today, where there's burnout and there's compassion fatigue, it's a gradual kind of progression to really a more severe experience, which is vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, where a person does start to have a trauma exposure response, right? And so it's something that changes within us, right? Our entire outlook on life, on the world, and our work is changed. And so you might not be able to see this. So there is a list on one of the next slides that we can go into more detail about what's here. But a lot of it just mimics a lot of experiences that a direct traumatic experience can have on an individual. And this can happen from deliberate or inadvertent exposure, right? Formal or informal contact, paid or volunteer work. Next slide, please. So what does compassion fatigue actually look like? What are the signs of compassion fatigue? It's going to be different for everyone, but what we do know just from research over time are things like trouble sleeping, feeling irritable, angry, sad, or anxious, feeling detached, definitely the emotional and physical exhaustion, trouble with having empathy or feeling empathy for others. For our caregivers and in our helping professions, it's this feeling of always feeling like, I could have done more, or really this feeling of inadequacy. I don't know why I can't say that today. And, just not doing enough. Difficulty concentrating and making decisions, and then a lot of some really somatic feelings as well. So things that may come as nausea, dizziness, headache, self-isolation, and then leading to some self-medicating, and certainly can impact relationships. Next slide, please. So how is vicarious trauma different? Well, vicarious trauma really does lead into this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, right? A sense that enough is, there's never enough that can be done. Hypervigilance, so just really kind of being on edge, diminished creativity, the inability to embrace complexity, right? So things just feel overwhelming. It's that foggy brain feeling. Sometimes it might be minimizing. So, everything just is no big deal. And that's really more from that detachment, chronic exhaustion, fear. And then things that we start to see could even be dissociative moments where people are really just kind of removing themselves from themselves. A loss of hope, anger and cynicism, numbing, inflated sense of self-importance. We see a lot more alcohol and substance dependency, and an altered state of self and worldview. Next slide, please. So what does this do? What does this mean for staff, for all of us? And I like a lot of these visuals just say so much more than words ever could, right? So you see a zebra here losing his stripes. And he's saying, I think it's stress. And I love this other one where there's someone in the water saying, Lassie, get help. And then you see Lassie on the couch in a therapist's office, right? So again, just that change, that shift in worldview and how we're really taking in information and experiencing things definitely changes when there is this enduring, exposure to trauma, coupled with this feeling of no control, with circumstances that feel hopeless and where you're feeling helpless, right? So those two things, it's a very kind of feeling of just deflatedness. Next slide, please.
I think we may also be dating ourselves with the Lassie cartoon.
Although
I'm sure there's plenty of people who know what it is, but I bet there's also some.
Yes, so Lassie is right. Lassie is that amazing dog that could go and rescue people and understood, human language and everything. You're so right. And so let's just add that to another thing that's making me feel hopeless and defeated, feeling old. So what are some risk factors? Where anyone who's in a helping profession, is at risk. But certainly some of us are probably more prone at different points in our lives, and that makes sense, right? So the more vulnerable, the more overstretched we're already feeling, our perception of what our own internal and personal resources are going to also impact how much this exposure will do to us. So professionally, some of the kind of risk factors are, lack of quality supervision. So really, what's in place? What are the structures in place in your workplace to make you feel supported? That you have a high incidence of trauma among your patient and caseload, right? So how much are you really carrying and holding for your patients day in and day out? Little experience or, new to this role or new to the field. Cultural clashes between patients and the organization can have a professional impact. Just the worker organization mismatch, right? So just, I'm not in the right place. The lack of professional support and system, which really plays into the ability to have quality supervision. Inadequate training and preparation for the role. And the work environment that rewards kind of going above and beyond, right? So where the social and work norms are that you always give, 150%. So the personal risk factors are people who already have a trauma history. Some of this can be really re-triggering, right? Pre-existing mental health conditions, again, somebody who's already having to work hard at staying well and supporting themselves. Lack of boundaries between personal and professional life. So many people who maybe never suffered from some of these feelings are now, given COVID, and many people are working where they live or living where they're working. The cumulative effects of trauma and stressors, again, lack of experience due to age or in your role, isolation and inadequate support system. So, as an employee, do you feel like you are, supported and part of something larger, or do you feel like you're just kind of a free agent out there floating, untethered? And then I think this is so important in our helping professions and has really come to light, I think, more than ever during this pandemic, which is this superhuman complex, right? The cannot fail. We use the word hero for our healthcare workers, and it's meant to be, something respectful and acknowledging the work that people have done through the pandemic, but it also could put a great strain and a great pressure on an individual, right? Because we're all human at the end of the day. So unrealistic expectations around patient outcomes, and also just unrealistic expectations of how much we can do and carry for other people without it having an impact on us as individuals. Okay. And I actually, before this webinar, I just had come out of a staff meeting, and a lot of this was coming up in our group, in our discussion today, just as far as client care, right? And feeling like if we can't serve them, if we have a waiting list, if we're not the appropriate resource, that somehow that responsibility is falling on individual clinicians, right? That someone even said it, if I can't make room in my caseload for this person, I'm just going to be leaving them out there alone, right? So again, just kind of thinking about how much expectation do we put on ourselves, and also how much are we feeling from within the organizational structures. Next slide, please. This is just a visual to really summarize what Yael already went through and what we're talking about, kind of what the commonalities are between burnout and compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, and then a little bit of how they're different. They're not necessarily just one gradual. Or vicarious trauma is more of these internalized experiences and having real symptoms that mimic trauma exposure. Next slide, please. Oh, I see. Is my connection okay now? Yeah, another kind of another reality check, right? Working from home, there's construction going on next door, and every once in a while, something to do with their drilling interferes with my Wi-Fi connection. So I apologize for that. Great, thank you. So then we're seeing some real impact, right? So people are experiencing burnout, they're experiencing depression, hopelessness, helplessness. That oftentimes can lead to high rates of physician and healthcare provider depression and suicide rates, right? So some of the specialties are even at higher risk than others, even within the healthcare field. But what we do know is that it's estimated one physician dies by suicide each day in the United States. 12% of male physicians suffer from depression, 20% of female physicians suffer from depression, and 15 to 30% of medical students and residents have depression. And it is overall an area, a helping profession that has increased risk of just dying by suicide. And why? A lot of it is what we're talking about here, right? Just this feeling of being exposed to people suffering day in and day out, and where it really can have a great deal of impact on us as individuals. And really, we're also talking about professions that for a long time, talking about some of the struggles and what it means could be seen as, or was worried that could be a sign of weakness, or that you can't handle your job, right? So if you're struggling, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling especially upset or moved by a patient that you're serving, that meant there was something wrong with you, right? But in fact, it's not. It's the very human aspect, right? It's a sign that we have compassion. And if we're not taking care of ourselves, that ability to have compassion is taken away. And that disconnection from the reason why we were brought into the fields that we've chosen starts to become harder to reconnect to as well. Next slide, please. So if it's impacting our patient caregivers, then what does that mean for the patients? Well, we know that, of course, right, strained relationships between patients and providers are going to occur, decreased quality of care and worse health outcomes. Patient safety becomes compromised, right? When we are not focused, when we're having a hard time concentrating, if our memory is impacted, mistakes are more often made. Which is, more medical errors, more malpractice, reduced patient satisfaction, and then eventually really can create this lack of engagement of the patients we're trying the hardest to serve, of wanting to even engage with the healthcare system, right? Because of these experiences, which then, is unfortunate and has even greater impact on more people. Next slide, please. And then what does that mean for the overall organization and practice, right? Because all of us we're the individuals that are making up these organizations and practices. So we know that there'll be higher staff turnover, right? And when there's higher staff turnover, the resources that are needed to hire and train new staff drains the remaining staff, right? I don't know about you, but we've definitely in my program have felt this in our own program, but just with other, organizations that we work closely with. And so, that drain where the remaining staff have to take on more is very real. It leads to poor organizational health. So overall, there's an erosion of concentration, focus, decision-making, motivation, and performance, right? So collectively, everyone who is a part of that practice or organization now are struggling. And that leads to lost productivity. So decreased morale, decreased cohesion, communication, collaboration, and quality of services. And I don't know about you, but if I'm in a place that's experiencing all of these challenges, that's certainly going to have an impact on how I feel about work and, at work, about my work and about the people that I'm working with, right? And we've seen a lot of this. I don't know about you, but, following some of the headlines over the past 6+ months, where we're seeing many people in healthcare roles contemplating leaving their professions, or many people quitting or needing to, right? Because of just that burnout, that there was just that surge, there was that need and that crisis that really depleted individuals, but also the practices in the organizations, right? And how do we sustain that over time? And, most of us can't if we don't have the right resources in place.
On a positive note, I read that there's actually been an increase in applications for public health, for degree public health. So, I don't know. That's not as direct, I guess.
I think it's all so hard, right? Next slide, please. So what are the solutions, right? Because we're not here just to tell all of you that it's all doom and gloom. But, hopefully what we're saying is validating, because many of you, like ourselves, are also struggling with this. So we're talking about it, we're training about it, we're the professionals, but we're feeling it as well, right? So next slide. So there's been a lot of focus and concentration in recent years around resilience, and that, the joy in our work, feeling joy about our work and connectedness actually has a direct relationship to our ability to be resilient, to develop resiliency in our work, and to be able to balance what the challenges are in these helping professions, right? This is from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. It's a white paper, but really it's simple, but it's not, right? So the first really step in how to creating a joyful workplace is asking staff what matters to you, right? And that's very important, because what happens with burnout and compassion fatigue is that we start to lose the connection to why we're doing what we're doing, right? And it can even start to feel like it's no longer a choice. And again, when we lose a feeling of our own autonomy, of choice, of control, that changes our entire perception and view of our world, right? when we're able to reconnect to what matters to us, why we're choosing to do the work that we do, it gives us a sense of power and control over what we're doing. And that we can make a difference, right? So the second step is really identifying the unique impediments to joy in the work. And then committing to making joy in a workplace a shared responsibility at all levels, using improvement science to test the approaches. So, coming up with a plan, identifying the problem, coming up with the plan, and then measuring it, what's working and what's not, right? So really putting science behind it. And then the outcome, hopefully, is that we have greater patient experience, more positive patient experience, organizational performance, and lower rates of staff burnout, right? So it sounds simple, but obviously is very complex, right? And even the thought about joy, what is joy? And that what we're really talking about is not burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. It's not job dissatisfaction necessarily, right? So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something much, much deeper than that. And also something that we've really not spent a lot of time in focusing on until more recently. Next slide, please. So a little bit more from the Institution for Health Improvement. This really goes through kind of what that looks like, right? So again, it's not so simple. It's not, let's find joy. But really, what are the factors that affect that? And so physical and psychological safety for staff, right? How equitable does the environment feel? Does it feel free from harm? Is it a culture where that's respectful? And also, is it a culture where the staff feel important and valued, right? When we start to focus on numbers and outcomes all the time, as far as patient satisfaction, obviously that's very important, right? But we also want to balance that messaging in making sure that our staff are also valued and vital to that, right? You can't get to positive patient health outcomes if you're not also investing in the people who are part of the team and making that happen. So meaning and purpose, right? So your daily work is connected to what really brought individuals to the practice in the first place. If you go into a field because you want to help people, you want to be a caregiver, you want to be a social worker, you want to be a doctor, you want to be a patient navigator, right? And you don't feel like you're doing that in your work, it's going to make us really contemplate what we're doing, how we're doing, and if we should be there anymore, right? So really staying connected to that, to the meaning and the purpose. Having choice and autonomy in environments. So we want, a happy, healthy environment is one where staff feel that they have some choice and flexibility, right? And also that there's recognition and rewards for the work that they're doing. You have a participative management. So, management that really wants to get feedback from staff, management that wants to know how people are feeling, how people, what's working, what's not, and doing something with that information, right? Camaraderie and teamwork are so important. Do you trust your coworkers? Do you feel safe with them? Is there social cohesion? Can people work in productive teams? Daily improvement. So really looking again at in real time, the improvement sciences, right? What's working, what's not, and constantly, evaluating that and being willing to adapt accordingly. And then wellness and resilience of individuals and as an organization, that these things are essential, that they are prioritized, really helping and supporting people's work-life balances, right? considering staff as whole people, so really figuring out what that line is, that what's happening outside of work does impact work and vice versa. And what is the overall organizational responsibility in that, and the real-time measurements, right? So again, this is huge. This is a framework, but it's also something that is, you can make small steps in the meantime and really start to think about that. But that you can see it doesn't come down to just individual behaviors or values, but that it also has, for real change, there has to be organizational buy-in, right, and commitment, and that the organization and leadership have to really role model the values that you really want to put that you want the practice or your organization to adopt. Next slide, please. So what are some simple ideas for leaders? So if you are here and you are in a leadership role, you might be like, oh gosh, what do I do? This is overwhelming, right? And so again, what we can do if you are in a position of leadership or supervision, simply starting to ask what matters to you from staff and really listening, right? Sharing what matters to you about, share what matters to you about the work. Really starting to look at, what gets in the way of what matters, what frustrates staff about the work, and really making it a part of a conversation, right? Obviously, when you're in a leadership role, there are some things that just decisions that have to be made, or certain things that just, if you have someone who says, I hate keeping up with my, my chart work. Well, that's not something that can, necessarily go away when you're providing patient care. But, what else is going on there, right? And maybe getting feedback about what the challenges are. We want to also, provide as much paid time off as possible, keep listening, keep asking questions, flexible work schedules, right? And finding out, what products and services staff like and what works best in making those decisions. Next slide, please. So, we've said a lot of this again, but also organizational resilience building is very important. What does vicarious trauma-informed culture look like? And again, it's encouraging self-care, having healthy boundaries, but also really operating and modeling what we're asking and encouraging individual staff to do, right? What we don't want are providing interventions that are not, solely left up to the individual. They have to be multi-leveled, right? It can't just be up to the individual staff person to fix things for themselves when it's a part of, part of more of a systemic issue. And then we want to come back to kind of the ABCs, which is nurturing awareness. So we want our staff to have self-awareness and also looking out for their colleagues, a balance, and we want to emphasize and nurture connections, right? So again, going back to that idea of how do we get our staff to feel more connected to the work, to have it be meaningful, that helps to build joy within the workplace. Next, please. Next slide. For supervision, again, we want to, what are some ways that maybe we're not providing space for people to talk about and share their experiences? What's frustrating, what's challenging? Peer supervision can be really, really helpful in addition to the more hierarchical structures. We want to, be considerate and really pay close attention to workloads and expectations of what workloads look like and checking in. And again, supporting our supervisors. If supervisors have to be there for their direct staff, then we need to have structures in place that also help supervisors, right? So really the bottom line here is no individual should just be absorbing everything for someone else or other people and having no place to kind of put that or to work through it, to process it, to share it, right? And when we start to do that, we start to feel very disconnected and isolated, and really start to take on this, this expectation of ourselves that we are alone in this. Next slide, please. So we wanted to actually get your feedback on this. As another opportunity to participate in the chat box. We're not going to go through all of this just for the sake of time, but what Yael and I did, where we came up with some really commonly expressed challenges that happen in the practice or in a workspace, and wanted to get your opinion on who you think is most responsible in addressing this particular issue. Is it up to the individual staff, or is it the organization? So why don't we start? I think the first one is probably one many of us can relate to. Caseload continues to increase without more staff. And if you wouldn't mind just chiming in the chat box, who do you think is most responsible for addressing this? Organization, organization, organization. Okay. Organization.
And if people can put, when they're in their chat, if you can address it to all panelists and attendees, it's just a little drop down.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah,
that'd be great.
Yeah. Organization. Okay. We're going to come back to this at the end. Team collaborative. This is everyone's issue to address and solve for. Okay, someone said actually both. Interesting. Direct managers with organizational support. Some people said individual because it's up to the individual to vocalize. Right. Okay. Yes, as a manager, I find it difficult and overwhelm myself when trying to cover for my staff when they take off. I'm afraid that it sometimes comes across as discouraging time off. I can totally relate to you, Carolyn. Yes. Yeah, so it's this a little bit of this trickle down effect, right? So, again, if you are a supervisor or a manager and you're trying to absorb some of this stress from your direct supervisee, but where's your support, right? So I think the moral to this one here is that everyone is involved in this conversation, right? We need to hear from the staff how they're feeling about their caseload. Managers and supervisors need to be aware of what's going on with their staff. And sometimes managers and supervisors are too overwhelmed and they're not tracking these caseloads, right? And then overall, as the organization, what are the expectations of caseloads? What is the number? What's that magic number? And maybe there are other things contributing to the feeling overwhelmed. It might not actually be the number on the caseload, but maybe it's the types of caseloads. Maybe they're not being distributed more equally across the board. All right, how about this one? Feeling sad at work most of the time. I think I'm seeing both into this one. Both individual. Okay. So interesting, more people are saying individual for this one. Yeah. Both, yes, some people are saying individual, it's easy to put on a mask. Must start with admitting this, which is vulnerable. The organization is responsible for creating the culture, however. Yeah, right. I mean, we don't know why this person's feeling sad, but it certainly can't just be an individual situation, right? Because if as part of that overall team, that's going to have an impact on the work and colleagues and patients as well, right? So again, it's something that really will involve multiple approaches, right? And sometimes, a workplace can be the most amazing place in the world. And if a person's feeling sad at work, it might not have anything to do with work, but it's impacting the work anyway, right? And so there is this relationship. And I think the most important thing here is that having a truly, trauma-informed workplace is to acknowledge that people are whole people, right? And that as soon as you walk into your office or your practice, the expectation has been set that you don't bring anything into work from home, right? But that's impossible. And so really having to think about our staff as whole people, right? So what does that mean? Can a supervisor fix the sadness? Not necessarily, but what types of resources does an organization have in place for that? Are you focusing on mental health? Are we destigmatizing, some of these challenges in the workplace as a value in the organization, right? Should we do one more? Okay, we'll do one more, but let's see, which one should we do? How about colleagues perceive you as constantly negative and mean? Oh, I see someone was worrying about being late. Okay. So again, the one we're doing is colleagues perceive you as constantly negative and mean. Okay, some people are saying individual, some people are saying both. Yeah, it's challenging. This might be more of an individual thing, I think. Yes. Yeah. So, really what we wanted to put these here for were a couple of things, that these are connected, right? So a lot of what we're talking about burnout, what we're talking about vicarious trauma, we're talking about compassion fatigue, some of these things could be symptoms of those things, right? And so we want to recognize that. And organizations do have a responsibility and obligation, as far as the environment that they're creating and expectations on staff to help to mitigate that, right? And to also have some resources in place for people who do need more individual support, that it's not seen as something, it's not something that a staff person is going to be punished for, but that we want to support the well-being of that individual as well, right? But at the end of the day too, right, there's certain things that need to be in place that as staff, right, we can't go around just being mean and negative with our colleagues because it affects everyone, right? But we also need to acknowledge that these are very complex situations and that does have a direct impact on a person's work, right? So none of this is just up to the individual. What we need to do is find out what's happening with this person first, right? And that sometimes it's hard for a person to see it in themselves. And so having an environment where staff can talk openly, right? That a staff person can go to a manager and say they're worried about their colleague and not worry they're getting their colleague in trouble, right? So it really is kind of creating this, a safer environment for staff. And we could go into a lot more detail with this and when we have time later, if anyone wants to talk about any more of these scenarios that you're not sure how to handle or what that means. But I think the moral to this activity is that, there is a responsibility as individual. We all have a responsibility, right? But we also can't change things that are from the organization that are beyond our control, right? So it has to be a relationship. Next slide, please. So what role does self-care play in this? Next slide, please. Even self-care has started to become, it's like, I think all of these terms, I recently saw an article about burnout, starting to lose its meaning because everybody is saying that they're burned out, and self-care is, has become kind of a phrase that we just, use for everything and anything. But all of this has been rooted in, real struggles and specific, again, in situations where people's individual resources are depleted because of the external factors really taking those resources from them, right? And that's basically what the helping professions, healthcare professions do, right? That we're trying to remove suffering of others, and that there is a likelihood that you are going to take that suffering on yourself. So our self-care really should be things that are replenishing, and that, again, really addresses the whole person. It's supposed to help improve our mood and reduce anxiety. So, there is no one size fits all as far as self-care. What self-care shouldn't be, though, is that it shouldn't be something that's forced. It shouldn't be something that, is put on your to-do list that just creates more stress. And that it should be something that refuels us and not takes from us. And self-care really is something that should be consistent practice, right? Self-care, one spa day per year is lovely and a luxury, but something that you do one time in an entire year is not really self-care, right? Self-care has to be, is an active kind of part of who we are. And that's where most of us struggle, right? Because many of us might be like, oh yeah, I practice self-care, but rarely find the time to incorporate this into our lives on a daily basis. And certainly very hard to do it when you're at work. Next slide, please. These are just some examples of some self-assessment tools. We are going to be sharing some of these documents with you in the follow-up email you get with this PowerPoint. We just really wanted to put them here as just to let you know that there's a ton out there as far as different kinds of resources that you can use that are free. You can download them, that are really helpful to do as individuals, but could be some great ideas to do as a team. All right, so this one is just really thinking more self-assessment and reflection around things that are work-related stressors. What are your personal stressors? It really helps you to differentiate between where the stressors are coming from. Sometimes it's hard to know. It also is really helpful in identifying where you can get strength and support at work and in your personal life. So it's an opportunity to really sit down and really reflect honestly with yourself about, what's happening in life and what's really feeding the stress, and really what are the things that help. Next slide, please. And this is another one, just more around lifestyle behaviors. What are our go-to kind of coping mechanisms when we're under stress? And, again, it's kind of a nice gentle way of really looking at what do we do? Do we take care of ourselves when we need it most, or do we do things that help us in the moment? Coping skills are really important, and I wouldn't say that, you shouldn't have them, but are there some that, kind of do more harm than good in the long term? Next slide, please. And again, there's more. Like I said, there's tons of them. What's most important here, though, when we're thinking about self-care, again, needs to be really holistic. So thinking about emotional, physical, psychological, spiritual ways of nurturing and replenishing. Next slide, please. And these are just some ideas, again, that you could maybe incorporate at home or even in work. Many of us, aren't commuting on a daily basis. And maybe in the past, we thought the commute was the stressor. And now that we're home, we've found out that the commute was actually part of our decompression. And so, are there things that we can do to kind of mimic that, that 15 minutes where you could just put your headphones on and not talk to anybody or whatever it is. So again, these are just creative ideas, and even things that you can even do at work, starting a self-care idea collection with coworkers if you have that sort of relationship there. But again, like really, starting to adapt this as something that's not on the peripheral, that it's an extra if you find time, but it's really essential for all of us to be able to sustain the lives that we have. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I've referenced resilience briefly. Again, resilience is it's another word that's kind of out there a ton right now, and there's a lot of research on resilience. What resilience really is, and the connection to joy, is the ability and the process of adapting well, even in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, right? And it's sometimes referred to as bouncing back, but it's not that simple, right? It's really the ability to be able to thrive, not just survive, certainly bounce back, but that there's also an ability to be able to grow from the situations. And so it's really a frame of mind. Joy has a lot to do with it, because again, it's really a way of perceiving the world, of that there's still positive aspects in it, even in the face of the most horrific experiences, right? So it's not something to be taken for granted. It's possible for all of us to actually grow and to strengthen our resiliency. It's not one of those things that you're born with it or you're not born with it. Next slide, please. Yes, post-traumatic growth. Yes, someone just wrote that in the chat. And again, this is thriving versus enduring, right? So we're not just trying to survive a situation, but that we can even thrive. And the things that are essential to this are a sense of personal control. We've been saying that, right? And if you think about it, when we start to experience vicarious trauma or post-traumatic stress, it's really that lack of control, right? That's what's being triggered. And so a sense of personal control, a pursuit of personally meaningful tasks, healthy lifestyle choices, and connectedness to others. Those are the factors that are essential. And that makes all the difference between someone who, who is able to thrive and someone who feels like they're drowning. Next slide, please. And, this is, again, I think you're getting the point here. One thing that I think is really helpful here, and again, I used to be somebody who'd kind of roll their eyes. Okay, how does breathing have anything to do with my resiliency? Well, actually, practicing mindfulness-based stress reduction, so breathing and meditative activities, really do have an impact. Right? When we are experiencing trauma or secondary trauma, our bodies, our minds go into that hypervigilance feeling. We start to go into fight or flight. You might not even be aware of it. So we're on, we're burning those resources. We're putting our bodies through a stress reaction as if it's ready for fight and to defend and to survive. And if we're doing that day in and day out because we're overwhelmed, because we're in a stressful situation, because we feel like we can barely hang on, that has real physical and physiological impact as well. So the breathing really does readjust our systems and helps us to get more to a focused frontal lobe place again and not be relying on that fight or flight survival. Next slide, please. And these are the ABCs. We already went into this, so I won't read it to you again, but hopefully when you have these slides, it'll be helpful. It goes into a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. This is one example of a breathing exercise. It's called the breathing waltz, and it's really just having, having a rhythm to the breathing that can be very soothing and gets us back to a more centered place. It helps to relieve anxiety. And we know that once that feeling kind of settles down, we're able to be more focused, we're able to be more present, we can hear things because we're not in a desperate state of just trying to save ourselves, basically. So, I'd love to hear from you if you try this, if you think it works. There's a ton out there as well, if you're not as familiar with some breathing techniques. And some people have also been writing into the chat as far as other techniques that help. There's tapping, there's a lot of different types of basically grounding exercises that one can do. Next slide, please. These are some additional resources if you're, interested in a lot more of this kind of vicarious trauma, especially. I highly recommend reading Trauma Stewardship. It's amazing. Also Transforming the Pain. We also have some links here to the self-care assessments, and you'll also be getting some copies of PDFs as well. There's a lot more out there. We just narrowed it down to, be a little bit more specific to what we covered in these slides. And I think now we're going to, hopefully we have time. Yes. Okay, good. We'd love to hear from you if you have questions or comments, things that you'd want to share.
Yeah, feel free to use the chat box. Yeah, we're going to get someone's asking about the links for the resources on the self-care assessments. You're going to get the PowerPoint and so you'll have those links, as well as you're going to get some PDFs of the actual assessments. Someone's asking about suggestions on which exercises work well with the team, like at a team meeting or something like that. I think it's hard to make recommendations based on particular, without knowing the team. Sometimes people may not want anything with touch. Some people want something with touch. Some people want the breathing. Like, I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, I think, I think it's what I'm always kind of taken aback by sometimes, and I, also as a supervisor that I kind of take for granted when I feel like I can barely keep up with my stuff. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not able to support my staff as well as I'd like. It's just really giving the opportunity, if you do have team meetings or staff meetings, or you have things that occur regularly, really leaving time with no agenda to see what would be most helpful, to talk about. Maybe it's just picking one of these themes. It could be self-care. It could be finding joy at work. It could be, taking some maybe more of a global issue and bringing it in so people don't feel like, they're on the spot to talk about something too personal. But I think that's a great place to start. And then really, finding what would make the most sense from there. So basically just listening and hearing what's going on for your staff first, I think is the most important.
Before people start signing off, we're still here for questions, but you'll be directed to an evaluation, and we would love it if you would complete the evaluation, because we really do take the feedback and implement it. Thanks.
That's a really good question. As far as, promoting self-care and then staff not choosing to take advantage of it, or it's not possible, right? So I think, if you want people to participate more, I think one is options. So like Yael said, not everybody likes the same thing. So if we're talking about self-care, maybe in addition to having a check-in group, maybe it's the option that people can do whatever they want, but the only thing is they have to sign off or, their computer for that 30 minutes, whatever it is, and to really have some options. I mean, I've run into this as well, where we've tried to do different things, even team building activities, and then have gotten individual emails where people would say, what would be a true break would be honestly not engaging with anybody at work for an hour, like I don't, that's work to me. And so trying to find that balance too, I think is important. Yes, a mandatory fun day. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we're, just in case not everyone's seeing that, just as far as, administrators in this are, it's a tough role to be in, because if the organization's not willing to give up the time or you can't find the time, I mean, you are also part of that, right? So you're experiencing this push-pull. And so I would say one for everyone, whether you're, direct service staff all the way to administrator to leadership, that this applies to everyone, right? There's no one who doesn't need the support, or, there's no one here that would be immune to experiencing burnout and feeling helpless and hopeless. And I find that a lot of times the administrators are in the toughest situation because people are expecting a lot of you and you still don't have total control in what you can implement. So if you don't have 30 minutes, maybe it's 10 minutes. Maybe even if you're someone who can't work around the schedule, maybe it's something like making sure that you communicate something positive to all the staff, on a regular basis, just thanking everyone for working their butts off for the last week. I think some of those things, we think are so simple, but I know when I get a message like that, that makes me, I'm refueled for the next 3 days because someone just acknowledged that they see how hard I'm working. Right?
Someone's asking about a way to bring up the need for the decompression time. So, because it feels uncomfortable asking for something like this. I mean, that's tough, gets in obviously to the politics of the organization, but if it's a group of you, I think it would be easier to, go as a group and not so much, maybe putting it out as like, we're all feeling X, Y, and Z, are there things we can do to help with this? And then see, where it goes from there.
Yeah. And I think also it could be helpful to, if you're nervous about the reaction, and framing it in a way of not presenting it as a way of like, here are the things that we're not getting, but here would be something that would be helpful. Because I find that also when you're bringing this to people, there's that you're also dealing with someone who may be feeling very raw and vulnerable and feeling like, their defensiveness could be coming from, they're hearing they're not doing a good job too, right? So none of us are immune to that either. That might be a good place to start. We're just reading the comments here.
Yeah.
Wow.
Lots of good suggestions from each other. No surprise there. "10 minutes for lunch." That's all ever people wanted. That's great. I'm not 100% understanding, Sarah, oh, and she just wrote to us. Okay.
Yeah, remembering to stop and say thanks is absolutely huge, and it can go a long way.
Mandatory mental health time. Okay. Well, it's just about 1:30, so I'm going to give everyone 3 minutes back. I know that's not much, but I just want to thank you all for participating and coming, and also just for all of the great work that we know you are all doing, even without knowing, you specifically. So, thank you for that. Hang in there. Feel free to reach out if you have other questions or comments, and enjoy the rest of the week.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of the comments. They're amazing.
Yeah.
Take care.